appropriate. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Truzaar Dordi. Truzaar is a PhD candidate studying at the University of Waterloo and a top 30 under 30 sustainability leader with the Corporate Knights magazine. Truzaar has published extensively on financial stability and low carbon transitions around federal climate policy, fossil fuel divestment, stranded assets, and carbon budgets. He is also the Vice President of Communications for the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. So with that, I will pass it to Truzaar.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction. And thank you all for our attendees for joining our transformation keynote this afternoon or evening, wherever you are. My name is Truzaar Dordi, and I'll be moderating this session today. And I'll just start by mentioning that I'm calling in from Kitchener, Ontario, which is located on the Haldeman Tract, land promised to the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. I also encourage everyone on the call to visit native-land.ca to learn about where you live, learn, and play. I'm excited to be joined today by an all-female panel. With us, we have Yifat Susskind of MADRE, we have Alice Hopkins from Foundations of Social Change, and Dr. Angela Carter from the University of Waterloo. So thank you to the panelists as well who are joining this discussion on transformations that put people first. So how we're going to structure all of this is we'll begin with short presentations from each one of our speakers before opening up for questions. I have a few questions lined up, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. As Alex mentioned, to ask a question, please use the question function at the bottom of your screen. And just another reminder that we will be donating 25 cents for each tweet that includes our hashtag #Cancy2021 to a local Victoria charity life cycle. So please do share the conference for a good cause. I've had the opportunity to speak to each one of our panelists over the past few weeks, and I know we're about to have an exciting discussion. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor to our first panelist, Yifat Susskind. So Yifat is the executive director of MADRE, an international women's rights organization that through community-based partnerships and human rights advocacy amplifies voices and creates opportunities for women facing war, climate breakdown, and their aftermath. Yifat's TED Talk, Think Like a Mother, has garnered over 100,000 views, and I encourage you to check it out. I'll pass it over to Yifat.
Thanks, Truzaar, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here with everybody this afternoon and for the opportunity to speak alongside such amazing activists, scholars, and thought leaders. I'm Yifat, as Truzaar said. I'm calling in from unceded Lenape territory in what is now New Jersey. And I'm really proud to lead the Global Feminist Fund and Women's Human Rights Organization, MADRE, that Truzaar introduced. And as you said, we partner with grassroots women-led organizations that are facing war and environmental disaster. And in fact, part of the reason why it's so great to be part of the conversation with you all is that our work is really right at the intersection of these areas of armed conflict and climate breakdown. And I know you all are exploring these connections. What we do is to make sure that people who are facing these kinds of overlapping crises can have what they need to meet their community's most urgent needs, so financial resources, and work to generate the kind of long-term social change that's required to achieve justice. So quick recent example, we have been working to ensure that communities in Palestine who are on the front lines of Israeli war and occupation can survive and rebuild in the wake of US-backed military assaults, and that they can provide, food, trauma counseling, healthcare, medicine to their kids, and that women farmers in Gaza specifically can build food sovereignty and resilience to climate change. And alongside of this sort of like provisioning work to build local economies of care in places that are marked by crisis, we also do policy and advocacy work to amplify our partners' voices for peace, for environmental justice, and to make sure that they are heard in the halls of power, from their own village councils to the UN Security Councils and lots of places in between. And our strategies really come from the teachings of the grassroots women leaders with whom we partner. It's their deep expertise and firsthand knowledge of local conditions that informs our work. And we believe that that same expertise of people in local communities should inform policymaking at every level. We we reject the notion that we hear far too often in academia, in government, in the humanitarian and development sectors, that, there's this notion that people in the global south somehow have experience that comes from living through the worst of crises like climate breakdown and war. And meanwhile, people in the global north have analysis and theory that should be the drivers of solutions to these kinds of crises. And we believe, as US Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley puts it, she puts it really well. She says, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And that's not only because of what they have endured, but because of the analysis that they bring, a political perspective that is born of lived experience and informed by values of cooperation over competition, of care for people on the planet over corporate profits, of reparative policies over militarized projections of state power. Those are the values we want to see shaping policy. And that's why we work to bring grassroots women leaders from around the world into really direct conversation with policymakers where we can. So last year, for example, as the pandemic began to spread, we mobilized grants to provide urgent aid to partners, things like emergency food baskets and PPE. But we also organized, for instance, a congressional briefing hosted by then Representative Deb Haaland, who has since become the first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior in the United States. And at that briefing, some of our Indigenous partners, women from the US and Nepal and Tanzania and Guatemala, shared this bold and very interconnected vision of what just recovery from pandemic looks like, making the links that we all need to make between the pandemic, capitalism, and the climate crisis. And they spoke about their community's vulnerability to the pandemic, not as a singular crisis, but as linked to these broader historical systemic challenges, right? They talked about how their generations long oppression as Indigenous peoples not only cut them off from vital health services, which we know, but also how targeted attacks on their roles as stewards of lands and ecosystems undermined community resilience. And we know how those same dynamics that make people vulnerable at the community level also play out at the macro level, right? We know how the debt burden that is a function of colonialism and a neoliberal global economic order has made it like virtually impossible for so many countries to meet the needs of their people, including now access to vaccines and treatment for COVID-19. And so we work simultaneously at the most local level, where the majority of people are able to organize, and at the international level to create the kind of global momentum for progressive change that we need to see. And one of the things that we've learned from uplifting the priorities and perspectives of grassroots women in policymaking is that often these women are actually the best policy advisors governments could possibly have. I want to give you the example of Yemen, which is a country caught in the vice grip of both the climate crisis and war, as you know. Women there have succeeded in doing what the international community has utterly failed to do. They're not only enabling their families to survive, they have brokered local ceasefires, they have negotiated prisoner exchanges, they have established successful humanitarian aid corridors. And yet these same women have been systematically excluded from international negotiations to end the war. And not surprisingly, these negotiations have been a colossal failure. So to address that gap, we have been building out channels of communication for Yemeni women leaders to be able to inform the work of folks in the US Congress, of people, the sort of gatekeepers of the Stockholm peace process, and most recently the work of Biden's new US special envoy to Yemen. And after meeting with our partners and hearing about the extraordinary but often invisible work of local women leaders in Yemen, the US special envoy has now agreed to prioritize the inclusion of civil society actors, and especially women, in peace talks. And I want to tell you a little bit about one of the women who made this possible. Muna Lukman is a Yemeni peace builder and the founder of an organization that we support called Food for Humanity. And Muna told me a story a few years ago about how children in an orphanage were trapped in the crossfire between rebels and the military. And the director of the orphanage called her and asked her for help. And she called Muna, this guy called Muna because he knew that she would jump into action. And in fact, she began, she came and she began negotiating with the rebels who had commandeered the rooftop of this orphanage. And she spent days sort of shuttling back and forth between these two armed groups and gradually won concessions from the fighters. First, she was allowed to bring the kids food and water, and eventually she secured safe passage for them to a quieter area. And one of the things I love about Muna's work is that it exemplifies this environmental design principle of solving for pattern. Solving for pattern means finding solutions to more than one problem at a time without creating any new problems. And I think that's like exactly the approach that we all need to take, because we are facing multiple overlapping cascading problems like armed conflict and pandemic and climate disaster. And that is why the work that we do is all about finding climate solutions that also serve, for instance, to advance the rights of women and girls at the community level, like a 5,000 member strong women farmers union in Sudan, or forging peace agreements that also include environmental protections, as we're doing with networks of Black women in Colombia right now. Making these kinds of connections between people and issues that are conventionally considered separate is how we solve for multiple problems at once. And making that kind of interconnection the starting point of our activist work also offers solutions to crises that, important to notice, the right wing has really no coherent response for. Climate change, pandemic, nuclear proliferation, all of these need to be addressed through international cooperation that is predicated on an understanding of human interdependence. And the right can't do that because they fundamentally reject interdependence. So working from that point of interconnection is also how we build broad movements for change, movements that can go beyond sort of transactional notions of solidarity to really building out shared political platforms. And that is exactly the strategy that's guiding the work of an international network of Indigenous women that we work with. And I wanna tell you a little bit about our partners from Nicaragua. Last November, as hurricanes Eta and Iota were like barreling towards their territory, our partner organization called Huanquitagni, which means Child of the River in Mosquito, used a women-led radio station, which we had co-founded with them, to broadcast information to help evacuate about 4,000 people to safety. Now, Huanquitagni was founded by a local Indigenous community leader named Rose Cunningham, and before we had the radio station, when a hurricane would come, Rose would travel up and down the river in a little canoe and basically like warn people to get out of the way. That was their early warning system. And we developed this radio station not just to create a truly functional early warning system as climate impacts become more severe in that territory, but also as a general resource to keep communities connected and informed on a wide range of the issues that they're working on, like ending gender-based violence and supporting Indigenous political autonomy. Now, several times a year, these representatives from Huanquitagni, the Indigenous women in Nicaragua, join our global network of Indigenous women in international policy spaces, like the annual multilateral climate negotiations that you all are familiar with, or the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And in these spaces, they are bringing the demands from their territories to help shape national and global policies, right? Because their governments are also present in these spaces. And they're working to shape the policies that impact their communities back home and to hold their own governments accountable to the international obligations that they've made. Because it's very easy for governments to sign on to all kinds of commitments, and yet we need that movement strength to create accountability, right? And that international experience for local women activists in turn strengthens their political hand back home, so that now Mosquito women in Nicaragua are doing things like running for public office and increasingly taking on leadership roles in their own communities. And in fact, Rose Cunningham has become the first ever woman mayor of her territory a couple of years ago. So, you know, whether it's Rose in Nicaragua or Muna in Yemen or any of the other local women leaders that guide our work, what they offer, I think, is a really powerful organizing model. It's place-based work that addresses the specific context of communities linked to global advocacy, through which women are building shared political power and collectively honing the vision of the future that they want to create. The future that they want to create for their own communities and for the world. And we share that vision with them and are really proud to be involved in this work. So thank you for the opportunity to share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yifat, for all of your important work. I think one thing that really struck out to me was Congresswoman Presley's comment that you shared: the closest to the pain should be closest to the power, and it looks like MADRE has operationalized this. So I'm hoping we get an opportunity to talk more about these power dynamics. Thanks so much. We're going to turn over to our next keynote speaker, Alice Hopkins. Alice is the program manager at Foundations for Social Change, a Canadian charity striving to end homelessness through redistributive justice. Their pilot project providing direct cash transfers to individuals experiencing homelessness in Vancouver has gained international renown. And Alice, having worked with charities and nonprofits internationally, brings a unique take to the charitable sector. So pass it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be presenting here today on behalf of our CEO and co-founder, Claire Williams. And it's unique and it's exciting to be speaking about our work at an event that is sort of bridging lots of intersections between lots of different topics under the theme of transformation. So yeah, I'm Alice and I'm the program manager at Foundations for Social Change. I'm calling in today from the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations, also known as Vancouver. So at Foundations for Social Change, our core purpose is really to innovate, test and advocate for new models that advance shared prosperity for all. We are a young organization. We only were established last year in October. And what we kind of mean by this is we want to pilot projects that take meaningful risks to advance bold social change. So this is change that often requires a significant shift in sort of the thinking, a disruption of dominant belief systems, and really looking at what is the current status quo. And this is really was what our sort of guiding principles were for our first initiative, the New Leaf Project. So the New Leaf Project is the first project in the world that gave unconditional cash transfers to people experiencing homelessness. And I just want to zoom out a little bit now and acknowledge the fact that when it comes to an issue, and I say issue with quote marks, like homelessness, as a society, we have often been fed a very singular story. Often that exists in our world in a very singular image, and it often tends to look something like this. And there are some pretty strong belief systems and well-ingrained assumptions that are associated with this. We hear them show up in refrains like, don't give money to a homeless person, the money won't be spent on the right things, it will be spent on drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. And this is really indicative of a culture and a society that has some serious trust issues. We have a really hard time with the idea of giving out money, and this mistrust really shows up in our sectors and our systems. So in the early stages of the New Leaf Project, our co-founder Claire was particularly inspired by the work of direct cash transfers in the Global South. And not only was she seeing the sort of evidence base that showed the significant measurable impacts that the cash transfers were having in people's lives, what really also struck her was what was actually going on in the way that this model was kind of disrupting the historical approaches to charity and aid, which often involve massive bureaucratic organizations built up around a kind of control of resources and assumptions about what people need. Whereas cash transfers were really starting to sort of shift that agency, redistributing the balance of resources back to the individual and handing it over to them to make their own choices. So in response to that, she sort of started asking herself, well, could this be tried out in Canada? And it's specifically with a population experiencing an extreme form of poverty, homelessness. When she turned the lens towards Canada, again, she was seeing the way that these kind of mistrustful, harmful misperceptions show up. The routine response has been to manage the homelessness crisis through the provision of emergency services, shelters, drop-in centres, and meal programs. And these supports do address people's urgent needs, but they are one size fits all, and they don't really give people the independence and the choices to actually transition out of that place of homelessness. So what we have is inadequate financial safety nets, one size fits all approaches, which were actually kind of inadvertently trapping people. And again, then we see these harmful beliefs and this feeling again of mistrust embedded in government policies. Financial safety nets and the way that income assistance is delivered is still regulated in a pretty punitive way. People have to go through stressful form filling and different systems and channels that are just confusing. So unconditional cash transfers really, and this was what was at the heart of the New Leaf project, is the way that they signal to the individual that they are trusted, that they are believed in, and that they can do what they need to do to move their lives forward. It's basically a signal to say that you are the expert of what you need. So this is Erin from our pilot project. She left home to live in a shelter because tensions with her family at home were becoming too much. And when we met Erin, her main hope, and the way she put it, was that she wanted to become more independent. She didn't want to rely on the ministry for money anymore. And so she used the money from her cash transfer to pay for food. She was able to cover the damage deposit and get into shared housing. She retained this housing and she went back to a job that she really enjoyed and was passionate about at a data research company. And she's now also an active member of our lived experience advisory panel. So this is a group of pilot project alumni that we established earlier last year. And this group meets regularly to advise us on project design, research dissemination, and we're still pretty young, but our ambition for this group is to absolutely bring the experiences of people who are closest to the issue up into the organization. So, our ambition is to start looking at how we can bring people into roles of leadership through this group. So just jumping into some of the actual details of our pilot project, we worked with the University of British Columbia to deliver it as a randomized control trial. So we had 4 groups, 2 received the cash transfer and 3 did not. They received some other supports, and every single person in the project received additional supports, like support with replacing their ID, a Van City checking account, and honorarium for participating in surveys. So we stayed in touch with people in the project. We met up with them at 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months to see how they were doing. And what we found was impact in several domains. We saw that cash recipients moved into stable housing faster. They maintained a level of financial security and stability over 12 months. They increased their spending on food, clothing, and rent. And we also asked people about their use of services. And what we saw was that by spending fewer nights in shelters, the cash groups saved the shelter system about $8,100. So when we factor in the cost of the cash transfer, that's about $600 per person. Then there was this, which we hold up as a significant finding because of the way that it really challenges those misperceptions that we still hold as a society about this idea of giving money to people living in poverty, how people will spend money in the right or wrong ways. So we found that cash recipients actually reduced their spending on goods like alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes by 40%. And part of this, which I think is important to point out, is that as people find stability in their lives, it's actually possible that they reduce the need to self-medicate because they are getting into that place of stability. So in terms of where we're going as an organization and what's next for us, we're still pretty young, but something that we've become really clear about is that we don't want to be in the business of charity. Our short-term ambition is to scale this work and build an evidence base, but we do not want to be delivering cash transfers forever. Ultimately, providing a financial safety net remains the government's responsibility. So in the immediate future, we're positioning ourselves as a kind of social research and development arm we will build up the evidence base, and then we will start building relationships with government to use this evidence base to actually start a conversation and rethink the way that we actually design what, you know, a social safety net looks like, rethinking welfare rates, income distribution, and just the general systems through which we support people experiencing poverty and homelessness across BC and also Canada and North America. I just wanted to end by acknowledging what feels like the elephant in the room, which is that when we released our findings from the New Leaf pilot, we could never have anticipated that we would have been in the midst of a global pandemic. But in a strange way, it kind of set the stage to have a really wide-reaching conversation about our work. We saw conversations about UBI, basic income, cash transfers, all being propelled back into the public sphere because of the way that governments across the globe were actually showing up during the global pandemic and really quickly, really efficiently rolling out forms of cash assistance with very little barriers in comparison to the way that they roll out income assistance. So we are seeing it confirmed that governments can act fast and they can deliver cash-based support in times of crisis. So I just want to leave with, I guess, a thought, a question, which is just that, you know, what if unconditional cash transfers became a permanent fixture in government's toolkit to transform the way that we support people in all kinds of crisis, whether that be relating to climate breakdown, war, domestic violence, or homelessness? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alice. I love how you call out our organizations as having serious trust issues and speaking to the ideas of individual agency. So I'm looking forward to having more conversations around that. I appreciate it. Our final keynote panelist for this evening is Angela Carter. Angela is an associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, where she researches environmental policies and politics in Canada's major oil-producing provinces. She's also the author of Fossilized, which I happen to have right here, and I'd recommend reading, which talks about how petro-provinces undermined environmental policies to boost oil extraction. Angela is now exploring research on supply-side climate policy and the first global wave of national keep-it-in-the-ground climate legislation. I'll pass it over to you, Angela.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the book promo. That was not a plan. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen with you and then we can dive right in. Okay, is that looking good for you, Truzaar?
Looks good to me.
Looks good? Okay, great. I am so pleased to be here. This is such a beautifully well-organized conference. It's really great to participate in an organization or an event like this. I'm speaking to you from Newfoundland, my home. I used to know this land as the place where my great-grandfather fished and farmed, but the more I learn, the more I realize that long before that, it was the land of the Beothuk people. European settlers drove the Beothuk people to extinction by the early 1800s. So I'm learning more about the history of the land that I'm living on. And the website that Truzaar mentioned to you earlier is such a great resource. Maybe you can put that in the chat, Truzaar, so people can find their way there. So I'm going to take a moment, just 10 minutes or so with you to share my take on one necessary transformation to confront the global climate crisis. And that's a collective effort to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So I would like to give you just a brief overview of why we need to think about the climate, or we should think about the climate crisis in this way. Quick look at what's happening in Canada, and then moving to the keep it in the ground movements. How did I get here though? Well, both my father and my brothers, they worked as tradespeople in the oil sector. So I've been intrigued for a long time about the environmental and also the social costs of Canada's oil boom. I began focusing on the environmental costs over 15 years ago during doctoral work on the impacts of the tar sands or oil sands, pictured here by Edward Bertinsky's work. And this was just at the time when this issue was coming to the attention of environmentalists. That work became my new book that Truzaar just generously alluded to. It was a really depressing project, I have to admit to you. So now my research is on the transformations that we need to get to a climate safe and just future. So an overarching comment, though, about the perspective that I take in my research and also my activism, this has really helped me, so I like to pass it on. It is a process of active hope. It's a three-step process of first seeing clearly what is happening in the world around us and why it's happening, taking some time to grieve and to reflect on what that means. But then not stopping there, but then taking that next step to envisioning the future that we need instead, what we want to replace the circumstances that we're faced with right now. And then thirdly, joining with others in a collective to try to make that vision a reality. And we can do this for altruistic reasons because it's the right thing to do, it's a necessary thing to do. But in so doing, our own lives are enriched as we become part of a grand adventure for change. So I'll explore some elements of that here. So rethinking climate crisis origins. The global climate crisis is plain, the challenge is extreme. We need to reduce emissions dramatically to have some chance at a livable planet. The scientific consensus represented here is stark. The problem is that our dominant international institutions, our dominant governance approach that tries to account for those emissions does so at the end of the pipe on the demand side where fossil fuels are being burnt. But the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been silent on fossil fuels. And to date, we know that it hasn't worked. The demand side only approach hasn't been effective. After decades of negotiations, there remains this terrifying gap between countries' commitments and a safe level of emissions. So we can see this problem in a completely different way. We can focus on the origins of global emissions, and that's fossil fuels, which are the lead source of emissions causing the climate crisis. The burning of oil and gas and coal has been responsible for about 80% of emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and they're driving along temperature increases right now. But we can be more specific. Researchers are now documenting that about 63% of cumulative total global emissions over time from the Industrial Revolution until quite recently came from just 90 investor-owned or state-owned fossil fuel companies. So we're at the point now where we're able to attribute emissions and therefore increments of temperature increases to particular companies. And I think what's important here is that half of these emissions have occurred after the mid-1980s when these firms knew for sure the climate risks of their businesses. So that's some of the global picture. What about Canada? Well, we've made and we've broken climate commitments for 30 years. Today, we're a negative outlier among the G7 countries. We're the only country to increase emissions over the last decade. Why can't we meet our targets? Well, mostly it's because of the fossil fuel sector, which is the largest and the fastest growing source of emissions in the country. So looking ahead to the future, Truzaar, your kindly moderator here, Truzaar and I recently considered Canada's oil and gas production plans into 2050. We wanted to get a sense of where we were going and what that meant in terms of climate policy. And what we found is that the federal government, the Canada Energy Regulator, knowing everything that it does about Canada's climate responsibilities, has projected that by 2050, the year that we're supposed to be hitting net zero emissions, we're going to be producing even more oil and gas than we did before COVID in 2019. So what you're seeing here is Canadian oil production over time since the beginning of production, the sort of grayed out boxes, the vertical columns there that shows the projections that the Canadian government is making. And what this shows is that we're going to be increasing oil and gas production for at least the next 20 years. Then we'll see a slight decline. But by 2050, we're going to have about 200 megatons of CO2 being produced. And so it's hard to imagine that we can meet that net zero target given what we anticipate in terms of production. Most of this, by the way, is coming from Alberta's tar sands or oil sands in northern Alberta. Meanwhile, the federal government and the provinces continue to shovel enormous subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. In the first year of COVID, we saw some 18 billion US dollars going to the fossil fuel sector in Canada. Okay, so what can we do? The barriers to change are too high for individuals acting alone. We've got major oil companies that have spent millions over decades to block climate action, even when they knew that the business line that they were involved in was creating climate chaos. Our major banks in Canada are heavily invested in the oil sector, and Truzaar can tell you a lot more about that and the risks that it poses. And meanwhile, our politicians tell us that we can have climate leadership and intensifying oil production, it's going to be all good. But of course, that's a fundamental contradiction. So yes, individual actions do matter. And here's a menu of all the things that I'm sure many of you are already doing or thinking about doing. The things that we do alone are important, but we need collective action to match the scale of this problem. And there's one way to direct our collective energy for change, which I think is really promising, inspiring, and super exciting. And that's working on bans of fossil fuel extraction. So this is keep it in the ground or KIG legislation. Some research say that these are some of the most effective initiatives at constraining fossil fuels simply because they cut them off right at the point of their origin. The effort to keep fossil fuels in the ground came from communities, starting in the early 1990s in Ecuador and Nigeria, grassroots movements that were pushing back given the environmental costs and the community impacts of fossil fuel extraction. And then over time, I'm sort of skipping over a lot here, but we had environmental organizations and then progressive journalists, as well as other civil society groups and research institutes that were starting to draw attention to this new way of thinking about climate policy. Starting in 2017, we saw a wave of these national bans, and now we've got plenty of examples of global keep it in the ground first movers. France, Belize, Ireland, New Zealand, recently Denmark. I mean, every month we have a new government that's starting to think about this. So how is this happening? Why is this happening? And how can we amplify it? And that's the focus of my research for the next years. Something that's exciting that's happening alongside these national bans is a global initiative to prevent the proliferation of fossil fuels. And there are plenty of ways for communities and groups to get involved to try to amplify that effort as well. So it seems to me that we're in the midst of an important first wave of fossil fuel extraction bans that are critically important in global decarbonization. And a lot of that, how these happen, whether these happen, we're finding depends on collective pressure, right? It's grassroots pressure, people coming together, deciding that they want to make this a priority in their particular level of government. But I should say before closing that, of course, all of this has to center on workers and people who've been made vulnerable by the climate crisis and our economic system generally. That's why any wind down has to be a just transition. We've got roadmaps now right here at home in Canada that protect workers and communities. Now what we need, though, is collaboration across environmentalists and labor organizations, Indigenous communities, academics, policymakers, those with decarbonization or renewable sector industry expertise to come together to make that path happen, that transition, just transition path happen. So I will leave it there, and thank you again for having me. It's really, really fun to be in this fine panel of people. I'm learning a lot already, and I look forward to our conversation now.
Thank you so much, Angela. Certainly we can't talk about transformations without talking about climate change and the fossil fuel industry, more so in Canada. I think we have some really interesting parallels between the pandemic and the climate crisis as well, which I hope we get to get into. So I'll ask all of our panelists to join us now. And while they do, I just want to say how much I loved all of your slides and how visual they all were. So thank you for keeping it incredibly engaging. It looks like we have about 40 minutes for question period before we wrap up. So how this is going to work is I have a few questions lined up. I encourage the attendees to also ask questions. Use the question period, use the question and answer tab at the bottom of your Zoom page to bring in your questions. You can address them to all the speakers or any one speaker in particular. And I guess while we wait for those questions to trickle in, I'll share maybe just a quick brief thought on how I think all three of these presentations tie together, ask a few questions, and then open it up. And if there aren't other questions, I think I have a lineup of questions that I can pull back on. So on some of the parallels, I thought it was particularly interesting that even though it seems like, obviously all of you work on different scales, both spatially, whether it's Alice in Vancouver or at a national level or internationally, and also working on different timescales, whether it's, again, looking at a year or several decades. There are several different parallels between homelessness, women's rights, the COVID pandemic, and the climate crisis. And one of those specifically is around partnerships and power structures, specifically through the lens of grassroots, the grassroots impacts, and how through inequalities, these cases are worsened during times of upheaval. Yifat, you're a global advocate, or a vocal advocate as well as a global one, for community partnerships, and have been obviously very successful in bringing these voices to the global stage. Meanwhile, Angela, on your side, you see these familiar grassroots, keep it in the ground campaigns, fighting against these embedded interests of the fossil fuel industry and the government. And Alice, you sort of sit in between there with Foundations for Social Change, working with both universities, the provincial government, as well as funders and philanthropic organizations to implement direct cash transfers. And you did so successfully, but I believe there was a bit of initial resistance in that process. So there appears to be the space for top-down and bottom-up approaches to work together, though it may be harder in some cases. And the question around that is, from each of your lens individually, what is needed to encourage deeper partnerships between grassroots initiatives and the hegemonic structures that we see today in a way that accelerates sustainable transformations? I'll open that up to whoever wants to start.
I can start. I was thinking, hearing your presentation, Angela, about the ways that so often the crises that people are dealing with at the community level originate really far away from their community, right? And so that kind of like keep it in the ground is one tactic where you're combating it at its source. But I think, and this is where our work is kind of complementary, right? Part of what we're trying to do is to build out the kind of missing infrastructure that people who are activists at the community level need to be able to influence policies, destructive policies at their source, which is in Washington or Geneva or London or wherever in these in centers of global power. And so working in international financial institutions and at the UN and with different national governments is, I think, like just another piece of that puzzle, right? And that work can be really complementary. And I think it happens in all kinds of ways. And I'll just briefly, really concretely, we've did work a few years ago with women in northern Iraq and Syria who were all living under ISIS occupation from about 2014 to 2017, and local women activists were like really maintaining community survival. The international community had basically no idea what to do about the Islamic State takeover of like so much territory. And part of what we did was bring women from Iraq and Syria who were in that condition together to sort of strategize, like, what were their demands of the international community from their perspective as the people holding down community life during that time? What did they need from donor states, from the UN, et cetera? And so like a consultation for them to develop that political strategy. We did the meeting in Istanbul for a variety of logistical and security reasons, and then invited donor state representatives from the international arena to engage with those women at the end of that 3-day workshop to hear directly what it was that they wanted and to be able to ground that in commitments that states had already made. They were not asking for anything that governments are not already obligated to do. right? And so that's like a sort of a concrete example, but I think there's a lot of building out of channels of communication and work that we don't have between movement spaces and as you put it, more hegemonic spaces.
I would love to build on that a little bit, or sort of reflect on it through what I'm seeing and some of the keep it in the ground movements, in particular the case in Ireland. And you know, it's interesting because what you're describing, the role that your organization has taken, it's actually really the key, I think, in many ways, as to why the Irish Keep It in the Band movement was successful. There was an organization that could do that kind of brokerage between international levels, also national levels of government, and grassroots people who wanted to make change, who wanted to resist, right? But might not have had all the capacity and knowledge and information. And so, and what was really important in the Irish case, I think your organization is filling the same role too. In the case of Ireland, it was a Catholic missionary, or a Catholic international development organization that was able to make the links for local people between culturally what was very important in Ireland, Catholic faith and background, and as well as what was happening in terms of climate crisis and, you know, far-flung areas where they had done development work for decades, right? So they were able to bring home this view of what was happening around the world, given Irish emissions, right? Given developed world, rich world emissions, and really bring that home to people in a way that resonated with them culturally. And this particular organization, and some of the stories that you were telling about the way that you're helping to build that capacity for women and for communities, they were doing too, you know, introducing the people to the kinds of policymakers that needed to hear them, making those connections for them or with them. Anyway, so this there's a lot here for me to think about, actually, but I think you've hit on what is the key to creating successful grassroots organizations. There's somebody that has to make some of those connections and do some of that connection work. Because we all know, like any of us who've done grassroots activism, we know that it's, you know, really time consuming, you feel lost, it's overwhelming. But if we could just reach up and make that connection to a more well-capacitated, say, international organization, suddenly that makes a difference, right? Anyways, lots for me to think about, but I think you have discovered the answer yourself in your own work.
I guess something that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this question, and just sort of where we are right now as a relatively young organization that is trying to carry out something that has not been done before. And when I read hegemonic structures, I think just the most immediate association for me was philanthropic organizations, the philanthropic sector. And, you know, starting out, we were very lucky that we were able to kick off this work with a federal grant, and then Claire sort of fundraised some of the other funds from private organizations. But it's definitely something that we are aware of in our work, which is that there is still, I'm going to bring it back to apparently my favorite theme. There are still trust issues between philanthropic organizations, funders, the ones that hold the money, and the way that they interact and have relationships with organizations who are doing the work. And, you know, we see that show up in strict guidelines and checkboxes and certain expectations about the way that you should measure your work using specific measures or ways of collecting data. And I think we are seeing certain established funding bodies in Vancouver especially that are actually stepping up and saying, we want to change the role that we play as a philanthropic organization. We want to move to a more justice-focused lens and, you know, think about, again, not sustaining charities forever. And I think something that we've been learning recently is that, you know, cultivating the partnership with those organizations and actually bringing that to conversations with other funders and holding that up and saying, this is what this funder is doing, and this is the way that we should be moving.
Those are amazing. You know, it sounds to me as though, you know, we need at the ground level the collaboration and partnerships and alliances in a way that amplifies voices, as Yifat was mentioning. But at the same time, we also need these brokers such as MADRE to achieve this. That's at the bottom up level, but on the top down level, we also need these changes to come from the power structures in place, like the philanthropic structures that Alice was talking about. And within all of this, there's this important aspect of storytelling and culture that can influence both of those in positive ways. Were there any last sort of comments that people want to build on from other individuals, or we can move on to the next question? Let's keep on going. So my second question is around gender, and specifically the manifestation of patriarchal structures in what I will call sort of micro, meso, and macro systems. Yifat, you talked about not in this presentation, but you've spoken about gender-based violence, discrimination, persecution, and the rise of those cases during periods of upheaval down at the household level. Alice, again, I'm not sure if you explicitly used this language in your presentation, but when we spoke, you were talking about the paternal systems of charity, and perhaps more broadly in organizational management. And I thought that really resonated with me. And Angela, I'm sure you're familiar with this body of petromasculinity literature. It talks about who makes these decisions, why they do so, and who benefits from them at the end of the day. So it appears again through these three presentations that patriarchal structures appear to cross across all facets of life in many ways. Obviously, they're historically ingrained in our societies. So in your work, what are the consequences of these patriarchal structures, and how do you envision stepping away from them? What needs to be done to correct it? I'll open up again to whoever wants to start that.
I think something that gets talked about a lot, well, I've been hearing a lot, which has really resonated with me recently, is that there is this assumption in patriarchal sort of power structures and the way that things show up, that around the fact that power is finite, so it's power over instead of power with. And I think and especially from like the other two panelists, what I'm seeing is that shift to power with instead of power over. So I think in our work in terms of cash transfers, we see it as we see it as some resistance to patriarchal structures, because we are not holding the resources as tightly as has been done historically. But I also just want to say that I think the power over, the power with instead of power over, is something that we as a young organization are critically reflecting back on ourselves and the way that we work with people who are in our programs. So we have our lived experience advisory panel, and I think we are pushing ourselves to sort of think about, okay, we've got the funders, but also us as an organization. How do power dynamics emerge between us and the people that we work with, and how do we work to level that out?
I'd love to hear what Yifat has to say, but I do want to just throw in a couple of ideas from my own work. This isn't the focus of my work, but certainly the notion of oil production being hyper-masculine and the impacts that has on women are very, very fascinating. I mean, if you go to remote work camps where the tar sands are being extracted in Alberta, what you find is that, women are living near the women who are living near these extracted sites are supporting male employment with a lot of unpaid social reproductive work. So caring for families and children and communities, all while there's this really huge wage disparity. Actually, some of the research is showing us that 90% of the extractive work, which is the high paying, good jobs, they're done by men who are supported by women who are mostly in precarious and underpaid work, services, retail, and so forth. And I mean, there's another layer here too, which is that women and visible minorities, including refugees and immigrants and temporary foreign workers, end up being concentrated in lower paid and precarious jobs, huge wage disparities. And then you see other kinds of precarity that is, coming out in the oil sector too. Women, especially indigenous women who are in economically vulnerable situations at the margins of the tar sands economy, are at higher risk of domestic abuse and sexual exploitation. I mean, there's so many layers to the inequities that are happening on, gender and race, and more inequities in our society. Anyway, so there's a lot there, and I think it's a rich way to understand oil extraction if we start thinking about it in terms of patriarchy or in terms of racism. I think there's a lot of good work that's beginning to be done in that area. But more positively, on the flip side, the movement to resist and oppose oil and gas and coal development, what we're finding in our research now and some of these first movers is that it's very much a feminist story. It's women who are leading these grassroots efforts. In Canada, in particular, Indigenous women. For example, you see the tiny house warriors and Sacred Earth Solar. I mean, these are incredible transition movements that are also exerting rights and sovereignty of Indigenous people. So there's something really, really cool happening at that intersection right there. When we went to Ireland to do some field work about that Irish keep it in the ban piece of legislation, many of the people that we interviewed were women, and they were saying, we came into this movement because we were inspired by being moms. And we wanted to be sure that we're leaving something decent to our kids. We want to work in a way that's collaborative, interconnected, a way that's taking care of each other in the movement. So a really different way of even working with politicians. Instead of wanting to have more confrontation, actually going into, right-wingers' offices and saying, what's important to you? And trying to meet people right where they are, in terms of this conversation, and trying to find ways where there's common ground and then build out from that. That's actually how some of these bands came to be, right? It's that kind of close, interconnected work that women did. So anyways, that's all I have to say about that. I'd love to hear what Yifat has to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to pick up on what you were describing in terms of the prevalence of gender-based violence at sites of extraction in particular, because that's something that is happening all over the world. And I want to just kind of like remind us that that same dynamic is something that we need to attend to when we think about the renewables economy. And this is work that we're doing now newly with some women in Democratic Republic of Congo and in Bolivia, which are sites of some of the world's biggest deposits of lithium. And we know that like demand for lithium is going to skyrocket. It's already begun because of its role in creating renewables, right? And we could very well create the same super violent, super extractive, incredibly destructive economy around renewables. And that's the difference, right, between just transition and, some of the other, sort of climate solutions that are out there. So it's super important to be focused on that. And we have this opportunity right from the beginning to do it right, to do it in partnership with the people who are going to be most impacted. And that means people like us who are sitting on the user end of those resources, right, in Canada, in the US and elsewhere. To really be in solidarity with the communities that are facing what's going to become, because we know the story, right? And so it's such a great opportunity that we can't miss to really build out what does supply chain justice look like when we're talking about renewables. So that's just, something I'm thinking about kind of listening to you talk. But in terms of like this question about like, what do we do about the embeddedness of patriarchy across like so many of these systems? I think one of the things that we need to pay attention to that there's so many grotesque and really material manifestations of that, right? And I think it rightfully, like, our attention is drawn to things like gender-based violence. But I think we also need to just think about gender not just as a system that, subjugates women and privileges men and tries to erase LGBT and gender nonconforming folks and all the ways we understand how gender is about social relations, but also to think about the way that patriarchal assumptions are governing not just how people act with each other, but how we all think, right? The way that we think, the way that sometimes our social movement organizing looks like, the way that certainly our policy making looks like, right? Why is it that, local small scale climate solutions are so often dismissed? Why is it that the very proposition that care and cooperation could be the basis for international relations, why does that sound so unrealistic or even sentimental? It is because all of us are operating inside these gendered norms that divide not just people, but traits and ideas, everything in the world, into these like made up categories of masculine and feminine, and then privilege the masculine, right? And that's not only about men and women, it's about how gender functions as a system of thought. And that system defines caring as weakness. It equates strength with violence. It privileges competition over cooperation, rationality over emotion. We could go on, right? And these kinds of unspoken hierarchies are shaping policy all the time, but we don't always recognize these things as gendered. And I think part of the unique contribution of feminism, and in particular intersectional feminism, right, that was developed by Black women, by women in the global South, that understands all of the connectivity between not just gender, but race and all the rest of how identities get formed. The contribution of that as an analytical lens is that it gives us kind of this toolkit to be able to see what is so often holding back progressive policy proposals and new ways of organizing. Because a lot of the times when progressive policies are labeled, unrealistic or inefficient or, never going to happen, what's really operating are these patriarchal values. But if we don't name them as patriarchal values, they just keep on operating because unspoken assumptions always reproduce power. That's, that's their utility. So I guess I'm thinking a lot about that. Like, how do we get sort of underneath of what we can see to the sort of subterranean ways that gender is functioning? And if we can't recognize that, we're kind of like at a disadvantage in our organizing all the time.
This type of question could, be quite difficult and possibly quite a negative conversation. But I gotta say, I love the fact that we were able to balance that with a lot of optimism as well. No surprise, we have a lot of work to do. Angela mentioned unpaid work versus high paid work in the oil sands. And then this conversation around the emotional lens of patriarchal ideas and how they influence decisions and actions, I think is fascinating work. But on the flip side, we have the movement of resistance is coming from women and indigenous women, as Angela says, a feminist story, and she also used the word being moms, and I'll toss in Yifat's TED Talk there again. Really great if you haven't got a chance to listen to it yet. Alice, you mentioned this idea of power over versus power with. Again, a very optimistic message. I love to hear that. And along this transition, we have the opportunity to make it right now and not sort of continue with these tensions of power as we go forward. I will also I'll put Yifat's TED Talk in the chat as well during the next few questions. We do have a few questions that have come in and some really fantastic ones. So I'll start off with tomorrow's question, which is a question for everyone in the audience. And I like this one. It's what inspires you and what are you most optimistic about?
Do you see how polite we're being? Do you see how each of us has gone first? I love this. I find this to be a really inspiring moment. I mean, every time I open up a newspaper or I look at my Twitter feed, it's incredible what's happening in terms of effective opposition to fossil fuels. I mean, day by day, and Truzaar has been sometimes, messaging me on Twitter to say, have you seen this? There's yet another investment, a major investment firm is pulling out of the tar sands or pulling out of oil. We have insurance companies that are, evacuating from the space. And at the same time, renewable energy sources that are starting to ramp up and then fall in price. So we suddenly have options. I mean, there's lots going on in this space right now that gives me a lot of hope. And, if we think back even say 5 years ago in Canada, if you said the word phasing out the oil sector, I mean, in fact, the national media wouldn't really run with that. Okay, there was like some kind of, it was a verboten notion, but now we do talk about it. And so not only do we talk about it, we're starting to make plans. And maybe the federal government hasn't quite, gotten in line yet, but we're working on them. But there's coming a point in time now where it's just not viable to think about the future of Canada as one that is, entrenched in an oil sector. There's just too much going on globally. And a lot of it has to do with what people have done. The International Energy Agency that just had this landmark report that came out last week, totally changing its tune on the fact that we can't afford. It's a waste of investment to be investing in oil exploration from here on in. And that's an incredible notion from an agency that has been advising rich world governments on their energy policy, right? But that came from the work of researchers and activists over, how many decades have the people from Oil Change International and other organizations been working on that, right? So we're starting to see that our movements are having impact, and we're starting to see governments making change. I guess, we're still up against a lot, and every week there's more climate stress that we're seeing, and it's always hurting people who have already been made most vulnerable in the system. So there's a lot to be despairing about, no doubt. And Yifat, you're raising questions that terrify me too. Like, what if we create a renewable or decarbonized society and we just recreate all the old social inequities all over again? That's not what we need either. But this notion of building back better from COVID and doing, creating a new kind of economy and society that is environmentally sound. There's pieces here that are starting to come together. So anyways, long answer, there's a lot to be inspired about, I think, as long as we can take that inspiration and direct it towards work, doing the work, and, making the change that we want to see. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I feel like super inspired listening to, the two of you. I loved your presentation, Alice, and so happy that your organization was born and is doing what you're doing. And it's exactly moving things in the right direction. That's what we need to be doing, and we're doing it. So I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. And I feel like, and I don't know if other people have had this feeling, especially during the pandemic, but it's kind of like, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, right? It's like, and we don't need to enumerate the ways that it's the worst of times. Like, everybody, if you're in this conference, then you're concerned about the suffering and the inequity that's happening in the world. And look at the social change that's happening. It's totally breathtaking. We are in this moment where history is totally accelerated. There is all this, all of these things that have happened. And as you said, Alice, things that were unimaginable, just a short time ago. So there's the example of what your work is doing that was considered completely not on the table a few years ago. You just said that, Angela, about an entirely different subject, but we could name all kinds of things, from moratoriums on rent to prisoner releases to, on and on and on, of what becomes possible when it's necessary and people understand that it's necessary. And that's the work of activism, is to lift that up for people and make them feel like that is possible for themselves. And like you were sharing in the Active Hope framework, have that vision of what is the world that we want to live in and want to leave for our kids, and who's out there that's going to make it happen with us. And that connectivity and organizing is happening now, not just in North America, but really all around the world in a way that it rarely does. at other times of history. It's really interesting.
Yeah, something that's coming up for me, like building on both of your points, is just almost this like snowballing of I don't want to say permission, but it's almost, I guess, to use our what we've been experiencing in the last year as an example. We had no idea if anyone would care when we came out of our results. We didn't. We were like, okay, we're going to bring this out into the open. Like, there's a pandemic happening. The US election is like coming on down the line. Like, we don't know if anyone is going to pick this up, but I think, and you know, like this applies to everything, not just our specific initiative, but we were just overwhelmed by the response of people who had almost been waiting to sort of have this permission to be like, yeah, we should be doing this. We should be doing this thing. And I think something that was particularly refreshing for us is actually the number of US-based organizations who have got in touch with us and saying, we've been looking into replicating this cash transfer project with unhoused folks in our communities for ages, and we've seen your work come out now, and now we're going to do it. And you know, that's just been so exciting. And I think in many ways, like, we just happened to release the findings at the same time, but I think what it unlocked was like this sort of all of these like initiatives that were kind of in the wings, and it feels like they're starting to come out and it's starting to snowball, and that excites me.
I am an eternal optimist, and it's nice to see people joining the bright side. Thank you so much, Tamara, for your question. We have one more question here. We just got another one as well. We'll start with Allison, and Allison's questions around city governments, municipalities, and what they can do. So she says, how can city governments, in particular city environmental committees, take action on climate change, including the Keep It in the Ground movement? And then she goes on to mention that she's also on the Woodstock Environmental Advisory Committee, and she's looking for some advice on what to do.
Oh, I love that question. So I would say, please go right on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty website. I will put that in, or maybe Truzaar will beat me to it. I'll put it in the chat. And basically what they're beginning now is a global effort led by cities to endorse the treaty. Vancouver, not a surprise, I suppose, but was the first city in Canada to endorse. But I mean, there's a lot now coming in the works. So I think that would be fabulous to be able to have a city near you to be able to endorse that. Something else though, so you say you're in Woodstock, I think I heard. So there are movements all across Ontario now actually to try to get city governments to sign on to emission reduction plans that actually align with the science. This is happening in our region of Waterloo region, so Kitchener, Waterloo, and then the townships as well. So this is local people who have come together in a really powerful and diverse climate justice group, and they're basically going city council by city council to pressure for the change that is demanded by the climate crisis. So, I mean, if you want to hear more about that, maybe that is something to replicate in your city too. Just reach out, get in touch with me, and I'll connect you with those folks. So I think in some ways, I mean, at the level of the cities, that's where the action really is. People are closer to their governments, and so they have more power over them. There's a lot of innovation now that is starting to unfold in terms of active transport and redesigning cities. So there's a lot of potential there. I think that's a really effective level to target your efforts. So I highly encourage. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly that one thing that I think is an effective tactic at the city level is to think about a kind of like twinning program, like a sister cities program with a community that is the site of extractives. And because it's just a really good device for bringing it home to people in your community and making the issues real. It's a really good kind of platform for education. And part of the challenge that we have around climate is really shifting it from like a technical and scientific issue into a human rights issue, right? And unfortunately, the worse that climate impacts become, the more people experience them viscerally. And so in a way, the damage is doing that, you know, for us. But I think there can be a really positive sort of bridging and solidarity work that can be also very kind of uncontroversial and acceptable, because that kind of like sister cities framework, you know, doesn't necessarily have a radical face. And I think it's can be a very subversive tool for doing like broad civic education with kids, with voters, through libraries, all kinds of things.
I wanted to just say in response to that, my favorite story that came out of the Ireland research was this development organization had worked for a long time with politicians, all stripes of politicians. And what they had done like 10 years prior, they brought these politicians with them. I can't remember which African country it was, but it was an area that was experiencing a lot of drought at the time, definitely climate related. And so these politicians saw, like with their own eyes in this particular country, how communities are being impacted. And then it just so happened that 10 years later, this politician ends up being the Minister of Finance. And he is the person who's in charge of thinking about a piece of legislation for divestment that was brought forward by that same international development organization. And so they could come into his office and say, look, here's why we need to divest this national fund. And, you know, remember when we took you saw firsthand. And so it was that kind of connection that actually allowed for that critically important divestment bill to actually take place. And that opened a pathway to then more ambitious climate policies in the country. So anyways, I think you're exactly right. It's being able to show people firsthand what's happening and connect through narrative and story rather than just drumming away at the facts, which I think, you know, academics, we kind of have a tendency to do that, right? It's all about the numbers, but that's not what really resonates with people. It's that lived experience and connecting it with their own lives. Anyways, so yeah, just that's my favorite story coming out of the field work. You know, a tale of how you convince a future finance minister, you know, show people.
Alice, do you want to hop in, or should we go on to the next question?
No, go ahead.
Sure. I haven't heard from Eric, so maybe I'll wrap up with one last question from my repertoire here, and then we'll close off right on time. Are we able to give Eric speaking privileges?
Yes, I'm on it.
Fantastic.
Hey there, sorry. Thanks for that. It's harder to break these things up. I guess more directed to Angela, but as a complement to noting the accumulated carbon emissions from companies and so on, I'll just look for your reaction and any suggestions you might have for me or others who might want to do something on this. The Canadian government on the national balance sheets of the country includes the value of the fossil fuel reserves that haven't yet been liberated from the ground, that haven't been burned, and that's counted as an asset, as national wealth. And obviously, I think we'll all agree that that's wrong. That's sort of silly. Of course, it's not only Canada that does this. I mean, this is under the UN statistical aid, you know, sort of direction on environmental accounts and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, just wondering about that, whether we all go in on some kind of a challenge to the auditor's petition process federally on this to say, like, you know, justify how this could be still considered an asset when probably from a carbon budget perspective, it really can't be liberated in Canada. Otherwise, we vastly exceed our targets and so on. Anyways,
That's a really, really great point. And so there's a couple of key accounting cleaning that needs to happen, right? So first of all, you know, what I was showing you from the work that Truzaar and I did a couple of months ago, those anticipated production, oil and gas production numbers, we got to fix those. Like we need to make sure that we have something aligned, a climate safe production projection into the future. We got to fix that. And then, yeah, we need to loop back around and think about how we're considering or valuing assets that, I mean, the notion of stranded assets, and this is something that Truzaar can talk to you about at far more length than I can, but this is really rearing its head in a real way. It already has, actually, in the tar sands in Alberta. So yeah, we're moving forward on a set of assumptions that are like from 2 decades ago. And that's a very precarious position to be in, not just from an economic perspective, but for communities, right? Like, so Jim Stanford's recent work is showing us where exactly we have levels of dependence, community dependence on oil and gas extraction. And it turns out there actually aren't that many communities across Canada, not what you'd think considering the rhetoric, but there are, certainly a dozen or so. And so what happens to communities that have been dependent on these sectors and hoping that their kids are going to be able to go to school and then get jobs in those sectors? This is really difficult for communities. So that kind of planning needs to happen to take that into account. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The balance sheets we need to correct for sure. It is definitely an elephant in the room and one that you need to talk to Truzaar about.
I would just add one thing, sort of from a campaigning perspective, because I think that part of the challenge that we have when we talk about just transition is that we understand that we're talking about cultural shift that needs to happen. And culture work is inherently slow work. For it to be real, it takes time. And we don't have time, right? That's one of our biggest problems. And so we have to think about how we don't fall into a trap of urgency, especially around culture work, because it to be sustainable, it needs that time to grow. And then where do we find the places where things can move quickly? And what moves really, really quickly is markets. Markets move really fast. And so I'm thinking about, I don't know if folks remember, Bill McKibben put out something, I think it was in the New Yorker 2 Septembers ago. I don't know why I remember that it was in September, but it was. And it was sort of the beginnings of that idea of if we can make it we just have to make it a bad investment. And so because the reality is that it is stranded assets, but it's those kinds of investments, it's like everything else. It's collective psychology. And so what are the campaigning levers that we need to be moving so that it starts to sound really foolish that they're counting on that money? That's kind of what needs to happen. And that's organizing work, that's political work.
I think ending on capital markets is is likely the best case scenario I could have envisioned here. So thank you for that. We'll cut off a few minutes early and give everyone back their extra time. I want to thank you so much, Angela, Alice, and Yifat for joining us this evening. Your insights have been absolutely invaluable. I also want to thank all the attendees for their engagement. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference as well. This is the end of the formal events for today. After this Zoom webinar ends, everyone, including the speakers, will be cut off. However, we will be moving over to Gather Town for a virtual wine and cheese. And if any of the panelists are also free for a few more minutes, there might be some additional conversations in that space as well. Thank you again for your participation, and we will leave it at that.